I've had a couple books where people have flown here and I've met them at the airport and they've handed it to me.
That's Rob Walling. And even though that sounds like a spy movie plot, he's talking about comic books. He's a collector. And for him, his collecting serves two purposes. One, it's a way to diversify. And two, it's bloody fun. I'm Harry Morton, and this is Moneywise, a podcast not about how to make money, but how life changes after you already have. In this episode, we're talking to Rob about the emotional and financial case for collectibles. Nerds, get ready. And really quick, the podcast is a show for Hampton, Sam Parr's highly vetted private community for high net worth founders. Go and check it out at joinhampton.com. Collecting, we kind of do it as a kid naturally. Pokemon cards, baseball cards, action figures, stuffed animals. We're almost collecting collections at that point. And while the Beanie Baby bust may have turned some of us away from collecting for investing as adults, it's actually not a bad diversification strategy, with some caveats, which we'll get to. But that's not the only reason Rob does it. It also brings him a lot of joy, which is really what you should be using your money for anyway.
It is a luxury that I've granted myself. When our net worth was $400,000, I didn't want $40,000 sitting in some asset that wasn't doing work because we needed it to do work. You get an 8-figure net worth and you can have $500,000, $1 million, you can have a lot of money sitting somewhere and it doesn't need to do the work if that makes you happy. That's at least my take on it. Like, why did I make this money if I'm not going to spend it on a few things that I like? Because again, we don't buy sports cars. We don't buy other quote unquote frivolous things or stuff people might consider frivolous. But I do think that giving yourself permission to own some things that maybe don't make sense, I had to do that myself because everything I owned growing up had to make sense. Because there was just only so many dollars to go around. And so I kind of had to go through an evolution after selling that last company of give yourself permission to be a little, irrational or illogical with it if it makes you happy.
Of course, this is provided you can afford to have a few million in bobbleheads sitting around with the potential that you'll never see a dime of that money back. Rob can.
I have an 8-figure net worth, low 8 figures. I don't know that it matters if it's, 10, 20, 30 million? At that point, it's all kind of the same, I think. And I am, my wife and I have probably a third of our net worth in public equities, stocks, and everything else is spread around there's a bit in crypto. I'll tell you what, there's more in crypto than I would like because it went up so much. It's one of those weird things where it's I'm going to put 3% of my net worth and then you look and you're like, 30% of my net worth is now in this super volatile thing, right? So I've obviously been selling a bit of that over the years. Some real estate, some metals, some angel investments, and collectibles.
We'll get into just how deep Rob's gone into collectibles in a bit. I will hint that it's enough that he even sometimes questions if he overdid it. But first, let's get some context about where his money's come from. Can you walk me through then, running your first big company? Because I know you launched a bunch of projects and it was sort of a stair-step approach that you've talked about, but what was that first big company?
It depends on how you define big. At one point, I was running a SaaS company called HitTail that I had acquired, and it was just me, and that was the goal. I had 6 contractors that I worked with, and it made, how much did that business make? Probably netted me $350,000 a year. And I worked 10 hours a week on it, And so to me, that's not a big company by definition, but to me, that's a hell of a business, It was a lifestyle business, and that was great. And then Drip was, after that, it was an email service provider and a marketing automation platform. That's the biggest company I ever built, which grew to, what did we have, 10 employees, a few million in revenue. And then I sold that in 2016.
So what was that exit like in 2016?
Very stressful. One of the most stressful things I've ever done in my life, but totally worth it at the same time. My wife and I actually just wrote a book called Exit Strategy, and it is all about that process. It's about thinking through your exits. It's about processing the exit and dealing with it and not imploding as it's happening, not accidentally getting a divorce or pissing your spouse. That's yay, I'm going to make $20 million. And then I'm going to get divorced the week after because I've completely torched my relationships. This is not an uncommon story. It's really, really hard. And then we talk about the after. What do you do next? How do you not rush into the next thing?
So is that where the majority of your money has come from then? Was that exit in particular?
Yeah, I actually did a podcast episode on my own podcast, and the number one way that I have made money in my life, the way that I got to the point where I don't have to work anymore, is selling SaaS companies, like selling them. And then number two, it's a little sad, but it's crypto. Because I'm not a crypto bro or anything, but after I sold Drip in 2016, you get this big pile of money and it's like, I'm going to diversify into a bunch of things, right? I'm going to buy some, obviously quite a bit of, index funds and such. I'm just a pretty boring investor, but should I put 3-4% of my net worth into metals? Sure. Should I put 3-4% of my net worth into another asset class? Oh, hey, crypto's this thing. So in like fall of 2016, I start dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin and Ethereum, just like, it's going to go to zero or it's going to 100x was my bet. I figured it was like an angel investment, obviously that paid out. So the number two way in my life is crypto. And then the number three is angel investments. And I put money into WP Engine in the first year and a couple other things. And that's a power law where it's like, I have 20 angel investments and, one of them made millions basically. And the rest are, break even or less.
And roughly how much do you spend per month? What's your kind of family monthly burn?
I'm usually really good with numbers. I'll be honest, I don't actually, 10 grand? Like we don't have a house payment, right? We paid cash for the house. So I went to buy a house and they wouldn't give me a loan because I didn't have a job because I had sold my company. So they wouldn't give me a loan. So I was like, I guess I'm paying cash for this seven figure sum. Nothing I ever thought in my life I'd be able to do, So without a house payment, it's just, I don't know, 10 grand a month on stuff.
Yeah. What do you spend your money on? Like what else are you spending on?
We like experiences. We value experiences way more than stuff. So we don't buy a lot of stuff. We have nice cars. I drive a Volvo, but it's like we get them used. So I pay $40,000 or $50,000 for, a car and drive it for 5 or 10 years. That's just how I've always done it, right? My wife likes sports cars a little more, but even then it's weird when you hit the point where it's like, oh, she said, I might want to buy a Porsche. And I was like, okay, go do that. She's like, you're not going to disagree. And I was like, if you want it, go buy it. What is it? $80,000, $90,000? Like, I know this sounds like a lot of money. It feels weird for me to say. It's just not anymore. You just write the check for it. So as a result, we don't have a ton of stuff. We have a nice house because we spend a lot of time in it. We both work from home. We have 2 kids. We pay up for travel. And so, if I'm going to go somewhere, I'm going to fly Delta Comfort Plus or maybe even spring for first class at a certain point if I don't get upgraded. And we stay at nicer places than we used to. That's probably the biggest expense in a given year.
Yeah, I love that.
And then stuff, what else is crazy expensive is insurance. Insuring this house, we have not a ton of cars. We have several cars. I think we have 4 cars. Just insurance on that alone is crazy. That's probably the number 2 expense, I'm guessing, in terms of a monthly or an annual burn for us, which is just stupid.
After the exit or a big liquidity event, there's always that question. What do you actually do with your money? How do you turn those big numbers in your bank account into something that actually brings happiness and meaning? For Rob, collecting wasn't just about owning rare, sought-after stuff. If that were the goal, it would never have brought him any fulfillment. What does make it a fulfilling investment strategy is that it ties back into something he's been passionate about since he was a kid. And lucky for us, the origins of his love for comics and his journey into entrepreneurship happen to overlap nicely.
I naturally was drawn towards entrepreneurship. I like to say I grew up working class, which is like my dad was an electrician. My mom didn't work while we were young. And so we never went without food, but there was no extra money, and I drank powdered milk as a kid, sometimes when we didn't have enough to buy real milk, right? So for any type of anything that I wanted, it was like birthday, Christmas, or I had to make money. And we lived out in the country. There was no getting a job somewhere. Like I couldn't just get an hourly job. So I would buy candy in bulk from Costco or Price Club. And I remember paying $3 for a big tub of Now and Laters. That's a US candy. I don't even know if they have them elsewhere in the world, but it was 3 cents per pack of Now and Laters, and I could sell them for 25 cents. So I had an 8X markup. And I would turn $3 into $25, over the course of a month or something, which was a tremendous amount of money in the early 80s. I could buy a lot of batteries for my Walkman, and I could buy comic books. And in fact, my brother and I ran a little comic book business. We never had a storefront, but we, in junior high and high school, would resell comics. There was a big boom in it, and we were being entrepreneurial. So I've always had a love for them as a medium.
Now he's just doing the same thing that he did as a kid. But instead of having a couple bucks, he's got millions. And instead of the comic books being worth 50 cents, well, they're worth tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the satisfaction is all the same. So tell me, which ones are your favorites?
That's so interesting because it's like, which of your investments are your favorites?
Yeah.
You know, how do you think about that? I mean, I guess realistically, I really like Spider-Man. And so a lot of like, I have his first appearance in like a mid-grade, because his first appearance in high grade goes for millions of dollars, right? And I'm not willing to, to put that much money into something like this, a piece of paper that can be ruined in a fire or get stolen. Like I have my limits. But first appearance of Spider-Man, one of my favorites. I would love the first appearance of Batman and Superman, but they're also too expensive even in the lowest grades. So I have Batman #1 and I have Superman #1. Those are not their first appearances for whatever reason, but in low grade, those are quite expensive and they're neat books. And probably my other one that, one that I wanted as a kid and I couldn't afford was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1, the first print. And it was like hundreds of dollars, single digits, back in 1985. And I couldn't afford it. And so I got a really high grade copy of that. And that book is worth six figures on its own. And that was a moment. There was a certain thing about some of these books when I hold them up or when I bought them and I thought, this is when I know I've made it, is holding this thing, because this means so much to me.
Yeah, I love that so much. And by the way, when you're touching them, are you like putting gloves on and shit? Like how seriously does one take comic book preservation? I don't know. This is not my world.
So they are encased in plastic. So you could, I don't have gloves on because it's just a piece of plastic. So there's a third-party grading company that grades them. And if you're going to do investment grade collectibles, that's what you do. Like if I were to buy, I don't own any like trading cards or baseball cards or any of that, but like you send it to a grading company and they say this, it's a 1 to 10 scale, right? And they say like, this is an 8.5. And so you kind of know what it's worth. So yeah, no, if these were not graded and encased in these, they call them slabs, right? Encased in the plastic. I would be so nervous to even touch them. I would 100% have gloves on. You're talking a $50,000 piece of paper that's 80 years old. Like there's a lot of danger.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. It's so funny to me is like to separate the joy and the passion for the thing and wanting to like enjoy it and like interact with it, because that's what it ultimately is for. But then you can't. It's like, I remember like for some reason this stuck with me when I was watching the, maybe it was Toy Story or something, like basically the idea of keeping something box fresh. I'm like, I get it. I understand why collectors need to keep it in the box, but it's also like, this is the thing that I've been dreaming of since a kid. Like I want to hold it in my hands and like enjoy it. It's hard for me to divorce those two things.
It is. And there are a lot of collectors that don't like to have their stuff graded. You don't have to have your stuff graded. It's really, if you're going to sell it, it confirms that it's authentic. It's not restored, because that drops the price. If someone colors something in with a Sharpie and it really confirms the grade. For books that I really like, I will buy a graded copy to me that is investment grade that I expect to go up over time, be able to sell. And then I'll buy a ratty, restored, cheap copy of it. I mean, you can have a book that's worth $50,000 in a high grade that you can get a ratty copy of it for $500 or $1,000.
Yeah, as cool as it could be to own a 9-grade copy of some super famous comic, owning something that valuable and fragile, something you'd be afraid to breathe on the wrong way, is likely to add some unnecessary stress to your life. But there is some level of stress Rob is willing to take on, not just because these are cool things for him to own, but also because at the end of the day, this is just an investment strategy tailored specifically to his interests.
Once I sold the last company and I was looking at ways to diversify, what I really was trying to go after was, I want to decouple, right? I want things that are not correlated with the public markets. And I thought that collectibles, metals, and crypto would not be correlated. It turns out when we saw the big crash in 2022, everything went down anyway. So I throw my hands up at this point. I'm like, I don't know. It's diversification, but I don't know that it's not correlated. But I was drawn for those two reasons of like, it's just another asset class. And it's an asset class that I have an advantage in because I do know the comic book world, and me re-entering it 5-6 years ago is probably when I did. I realized, oh my gosh, it might be cool to put a few $100,000 into this asset class and kind of just, it's like a hobby / way to diversify is how I think about it. I enjoy it more than owning index funds, which cuts both ways, right? Because if you enjoy something, you can sometimes convince you there's emotion there. And so it's like, I want to buy this book. Is it because it's a really good investment or because I just want it? So you do have to weigh that.
Rob's not just collecting for fun, but the fact that he loves what he's collecting gives him an edge that most investors don't have. Collecting purely as an investment strategy without that is a much riskier game. Which is good news for all you comic book nerds. Your brain full of seemingly useless knowledge might actually pay off after all.
If I could have my druthers, I would collect cards rather than comic. Cards are smaller. They're easier to store. They're easier to ship. They're less likely to get damaged. But I don't know anything about cards, right? I don't have an advantage. Much like the same reason 20 years ago, I was trying to make money or to become financially independent by investing in real estate in Los Angeles. It's where we lived at the time. And I realized I had no advantage. No advantage. I was just like everybody else. And that's why I got into software and started building SaaS companies, is I had an advantage because it's hard to do. And I was a developer. And then I learned how to market, right? Similar, the reason I went with comics is I have some type of advantage because I have this background, right? I have 20, 30 years of knowledge of it. And I collected as a kid. But all things being equal, I would go for cards. They're simpler.
That's not to say Rob doesn't dip his toes in other collectibles. He's just not relying on them for the same kind of return.
I've dabbled in other things. I own a few pieces of original art, like Eastman and Laird, who created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I have some pieces of theirs from the first 3 or 4 books. But art is expensive and it's one of a kind, and I'm always like, it's hard to value. I do own a bunch of signatures. At one point, I realized autographs are actually shockingly inexpensive. I say shockingly, compared to a lot of things. You can get a Picasso autograph. So I have like him writing something in, I think it was in Spanish, and then signing it. And I have this little card. And I think I got it for like $2,000 at auction. And it's just neat to me that Picasso signed that, right? I have a tattoo of one of Picasso's, like a guitar on my arm. And so it's like meaningful. I got an Alexander Hamilton signature for like $4,000 or $5,000. And that's neat. Like it's a piece of paper that he wrote on in the late 17, early 1800s. That's neat. I got a Napoleon signature for $1,200. Like, think about that. It's so neat, And so I view those as just, it's cool. I have maybe 10 or 15 signatures. Maybe they'll be worth more later, but there's also a neat factor of owning something that does retain its value. These things are not going to zero. It's not like I bought a brand new car and drove it off a lot, But I don't view those as much as investments. The comics that I buy, I view like, these should go up. Otherwise, I'm not making a good decision with my money.
What percentage of your net worth is in collectibles right now?
I can tell you what percent I wish was in collectibles. I think 3 to 5% is probably where I'd prefer to be.
Yeah.
Let's just say it's 10 to 12%, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
Part of it is because of appreciation. Because things have gone up, and I was like, you get an attachment to them, and it's like, well, I don't want to sell that one because I believe long-term in it. And part of it is a little lack of self-control, if I'm being honest.
A lot of people think about collectibles as sort of as fun rather than like a serious investment. So like, what's your argument for it? This is hard to divorce the passion piece from the fact that you have the unfair advantage that you talked about, but I'm interested in this idea of like, would you still buy into them if you weren't a fan, but you did have that sort of knowledge somehow without being a fan?
I probably would, because even before I got back into comics, because it just kind of occurred to me one day, I was like, I wonder what comics are doing. I haven't even thought about comic books in 20 years. Like, I wonder what they're doing. But even before that, I was already buying little things that I enjoyed. Like Bill Watterson, right, is the guy who created Calvin and Hobbes. And he's just a great artist. He didn't sign very much. He's just kind of a curmudgeon, and he's still alive. But as a result, like anything he signs is worth a lot of money. And before I bought comics, I had a little Bill Watterson signed thing that I was hanging on my wall. And that was neat to me. And I did view it as like, I bet that'll go up in value, but I can also justify it because I enjoy it. And that one, funny story, I got it at auction for like $4,000, maybe $5,000. And then a year later, it was auctioned. It went for like $15,000 or $20,000. And I sold mine because I can't justify hanging something on my wall that's worth that much. That's crazy talk, right? So I up and sold it. I'm not sure that I answered your question, though. Your question was, would I do it if I didn't enjoy it purely as an investment?
Yeah.
And my answer is yes. I think I would have, because I really wanted the diversification. The difference is I probably would have invested. There are like these micro, like almost private equity funds or these private investment funds where they make the investment decisions. And if I didn't know it, I probably would have put a small amount, again, 2, 3, 4% of my net worth into one of those funds and let them manage it and make the decisions, is how I would have handled it. Similar to how I allow Vanguard or T. Rowe Price to kind of just buy indexes and this and that, right? I don't buy individual stocks at all because I don't feel like I have an advantage.
No, same. That makes total sense to me. By the way, what's the most expensive collectible you own? Is it the Turtles? What did you say? Turtles number 1?
Turtles number 1. I think it's Superman number 1. or Batman #1, I think are the two that I think are even worth more. The Turtles took a big hit. They spiked way up in 2021, and then they took a big dive in 2022. And so I think the #1 is worth less now. This is that thing of it's a short-term versus a long-term bet to me too, right?
That's so interesting to me that they fluctuate in that way. That is kind of fascinating to me. Is that because of like the cycle of the movie? Like, because obviously there's been a couple of the Turtles movies. Like, is that what spiked it? Or like, it's super interesting that suddenly it goes out of favor.
It was the asset bubble. Everything that happened to, the money getting pumped in 2020 and 2021, that again, that's where I was thinking, well, comics are not, or collectibles in general are not going to be correlated with, because what happened? Stocks went up, startup valuations went up, crypto went up, kind of everything went up. Collectibles did too. And then what happened in 2022, it all came crashing down. And that was a big thing. The difference with Turtles, the reason Turtles has crashed so hard is it is more of a modern comic. It's made in 1984. There are more copies and higher grades. So there's still demand, but there's a lot of more supply compared to Superman #1, where they have a census of how many of them are graded. And there's only 77 in the world that are encased, graded. Now, people think that there are another 30, 40, 50 that are ungraded in the world, maybe up to another 77, but that's it. That's the total population of that comic in the world. And so if you want to buy it, it's just not going to fall that far. The other weird thing is valuing these things. It's not like a stock where you can just go and say, well, how much is this worth? Because a stock is traded hourly, every minute, every microsecond, a popular stock, right? You know the value of it, the bid and the ask spread. What about a comic book that in that grade only sells every 2 years? What is the value today if a copy hasn't sold for 12, 18, 24 months? So it gets, the rarer you get, it does become a little more, I won't say a guessing game, but you do have to kind of use some judgment, so it's not an efficient market, if that makes sense. It's not as liquid as a stock or crypto that I can sell today. If I wanted to sell one of my expensive books, I can set it as a buy it now, and it might take months and months and months to sell. Or even if I want to sell it via auction, there's only so many big auctions in any given year. It's not like eBay where everything's coming up. If you're going to sell a $50,000 book, you don't put it on eBay, right?
What's your experience like selling it? Like, are you just sitting there watching the number tick up and like hoping to God you don't lose tens of thousands of dollars?
Yeah, that's usually what it is. I mean, I've sold a lot fixed price. Basically, when I find myself either thinking it's not a good investment or when I don't enjoy owning it anymore. When I look at it and I'm like, why do I own this? This is a waste. Then I'll usually start by trying to do a fixed price sale because that's the safer way to go. And when that sells, it's like, oh, good, I'm getting rid of something. It'd be like, if you have an old pair of shoes or a bunch of books and you're like, when you sell them, it's like this feeling of a little bit of freedom that I'm getting rid of this stuff. But putting them up for auction is stressful. And sometimes it goes over what you think it is. But in my experience, most of the time, it goes for less than I think it's worth. And it's super frustrating.
Do you personally have a rule for how much you'll spend as well?
I probably should. And I used to have this mental rule of like, well, I just can't bring myself to spend more than $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000. But then the further I got into it, I started realizing, according to me, there are some really good investments in some older books. The first wave of books was Golden Age. It's when DC was big, right? So Justice League, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, versus Marvel took over in the Silver Age, which was, I think, started in 1962. And that's when like Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Hulk, Avengers, Iron Man, they all came out, right?
Got it.
So if you go back to the Golden Age, that's where the books are a lot more rare because you imagine a book being printed. I mean, these were newsprint and they were just for kids and people would throw them away. The fact that there's even 77 grade copies of Superman #1 is actually quite a testament. Are there 77 copies of the newspaper that came out the day, the New York Times that came out the day Superman #1 did? I don't think those exist. So it's kind of, an interesting thought process. But what I realized was that getting into the Golden Age is more expensive, but I actually think they hold their value better. And I think Silver Age holds its value better than the Bronze Age is what it's called, and Bronze Age better than moderns. And moderns are like the last 20, 25 years, I think is what it is. So I started realizing, I want to have a hard portfolio, like diversification percentage limit, but on any individual book, as long as I can get it insured and store it in a safety deposit box, I'm willing to flex on that. And so that is when I started moving into ones where, man, you're sitting there bidding, it's online, it's a live auction. There's an auctioneer and you're just sweating because you're like, I cannot believe I'm hitting this bid button. And then when do I stop? When someone outbid me by $2,000 on a $50,000 or $100,000 book, Am I willing to pay 2,000 more? Well, maybe I'll justify it. Maybe I'll go over my, so it does. This is where if you're not into it, if it's not fun, don't do it because it's time consuming.
Yeah. Well, see, I sweat over like a pair of shoes on eBay. So like, I'm sitting there like the last 30 seconds, like, okay, this is my number.
Yeah.
Do you go in with a number? And it sounds like maybe there is some flex there, but like, how do you stop yourself? Because I think about this when I'm watching like the big art auctions when they happen and like, some record breaking number is sold at auction and you kind of watch the clip on the news. I'm wondering what's going through the psyche of the people that are bidding on this thing. And at what point are they going, no, this is silly now. I can't go any higher.
It depends on how badly you want the thing, and it depends on how often it comes up for auction. That's it. So there are some things where I'm like, that'd be nice to have. And so I think it's worth $10,000 based on previous comps and other grades around it or whatever. I'd be willing to pay $9,500 for it, or $9,000, or something, or even 10. And then if it goes past that, I'm like, that's okay. And then there's others where it's like, this only comes up for auction there's books I see that are up for auction every 2 years, every 3 years in a particular grade or in a way that's affordable. And those ones get tougher because then you're like, well, I think this is worth 30 grand, but it's like, if I miss it, I need to wait a very long time to get it again. And so those are the ones that I think there's a bit more flex. And so when you've seen Dorothy's red ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz, those just got auctioned for $30-something million in the last few months. Or there was like a Declaration of Independence, I believe. There's only like 10 or 11 known copies. And one of those there's 3 in private hands, and one of those came up for sale. Man, all bets are off then. Or Da Vinci, like any type of Da Vinci thing. Like there are certain things that are just so rare. It's like, I think a billionaire is just like at all costs. They don't even care, right?
Yeah, there's only so often a banana gaffer taped to a wall comes up, right? So you just got to act fast.
This is true. Oh boy. I watch things like that and I'm like, oh no. Oh, don't do that. Yeah. No, I don't buy, I buy things that are proven properties.
Yeah,
it's like everybody I name, Spider-Man, Batman, Superman. It's like, you can go to Google or ChatGPT and just type in like, what are the top 10 most valuable Silver Age comic books? And what are the top 10 most valuable Golden Age comic books, right? And it'll give you a list. And frankly, the ones that are most valuable right now in those two eras, it's all the first appearances of everybody. We'd say it's Avengers #1, it's Spider-Man's first appearance. And so diversifying, my initial thing was, I'm just going to diversify across the Silver Age ones because you can get those relatively inexpensive. And I got the top 5 or 10 and just was like, cool, that's my index fund.
Yeah, sure.
That's how I think about it.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
If I had used my head, this is the thing where when it's a hobby versus an investment, I kind of knew like Spider-Man is super, super popular. And so Amazing Fantasy 15 is his first appearance. And if I had just put all the money into a bunch of copies of Amazing Fantasy 15, because there are thousands that are graded, I probably would have done better than anything else. But instead, I said, well, I'm going to diversify. 1, because that's what you do with investments, I guess. And 2, because it's more fun. Because owning 10 copies of one book is just kind of boring, Yeah. And instead, I bought a bunch of Superman, Batman, Turtles, and it's more fun for me. Do I think it's returned as well as it probably could have? No. And I think that, there's this again where it is this balance of like hobby versus a true pure investment play.
The best investments don't just grow your net worth, they make your life richer. That's why that balance is so important to Rob. And that emotional return he gets also helps offset some of the annoyances from investing in such fragile assets.
The amount of money you have to spend on insurance and safety deposit boxes or a safe or whatever, like it's a physical thing. It's kind of a pain in the ass. It's not a passive investment like a stock or a bond.
Do you keep anything of value at home, like in a safe or whatever, or is it purely you kind of outsource that side of things?
I outsource the expensive books that I'm not willing to lose in a fire, basically. So the cheaper books, I do have a safe here at the house and I stick them in there, and we have an alarm system and I have insurance on everything, for the full value. So I would get the money back, which is fine. But what's interesting is I didn't think about this when I was like, hey, I'm going to buy some comics and put some net worth in. And then I started having these, they were just sitting on a shelf in a cabinet. And my wife was like, how much are those worth? Like just these things here that like the cleaners could knock over, Yeah. And I was like, oh, all of those together, I don't know, $100,000. And she's like, what? Like store these somewhere else, And it was this realization of like, oh yeah. And I guess I probably need to insure these because like homeowners insurance doesn't cover them. And even if you put them in a bank, like in a safety deposit box, banks in the US, they don't insure that stuff. It's on you. If there was a fire or it got robbed, my understanding anyways, is that I think if it's like cash, they'll reimburse it. But if it's like collectibles or something, they won't. So you really need third-party insurance on this stuff.
Yeah, okay. So it's not like coming around your house isn't like visiting a drug baron with like all these big expensive sculptures like everywhere out on show.
No, and
like it's all kind of put away. Does that remove any of the joy, by the way, of like having to kind of hide them away a bit?
It's not bad because I am able to open a closet and see, enough of them that I'm like, oh, it's still my hobby. This is a neat thing. I do miss the more expensive ones. Those are the fun ones to look at. And I got to drive to a bank to look at them. So yes, that does decrease. I wish I could justify keeping them here. I own some pieces of art and I don't hang them because the light from the window will slowly bleach all art over time. And so that feels weird. I do have a Beatles gold record that was for Abbey Road. So Abbey Road's been platinum 30 times. And so they've issued 30 gold records to all 4 of the Beatles, right? So 120 of these gold records. And I have one of them. And it's like, cool. I think I got it for $4,000 or $5,000. I do hang that on my wall because I don't even think I have insurance on that one, actually.
Overall, aside from the amount of joy it brings him to have these items and spend his time seeking them out, it's also been a pretty decent investment purely from a financial point of view. How much do you think you're up on your investments on these things?
You never know till you sell.
Sure.
But, I have a spreadsheet, of course, with what I think are the values. And I think I'm probably up about 30% overall, 25 to 30%. That's not annual, that's total. But at one point I was up 50, 60%, you know what I mean? And then I put money into it in 2021 and then it dropped. So it's like, it's fine. It has not outpaced the stock market, over the time that I've been invested for sure.
Have they performed better than like gold, for example?
Yes, they perform better than gold. They have not performed better than crypto or the stock market.
I figured.
Originally they did. So when I started buying these, maybe it was 2017 or 18, for the first few years, they were moving faster than the stock market. And then they had this huge run up in 2021 and 2020 during the asset bubble. And then when they came down, though, they came down hard. The volatility of collectibles, I'm now learning, is more than I think than the stock market. Although I guess the stock market had its big crunch right in the financial crisis, 08, 09. This is kind of like an equivalent of that in collectibles, where the market as a whole from its peak is probably down 40 or 50%.
Wow.
So the only reason I'm ahead is because I did start buying in 17 and 18 as it ran up. So they're back down to like 2020 levels basically in terms of a lot of pricing.
Of course, not every bet pays off.
I have several that have tanked because they're volatile when they don't come up for auction very often. If there's not enough demand for that particular book at that particular time, they'll just drop. So you get you pay 20 grand for a book and next auction a year later, it sells for 12 grand. And it's just like, oh boy, that was not a good choice. So I have a few 9.9s that did that. That's just never going to happen with a Superman #1 or a Batman #1. Someone's going to backstop that book. They're not going to let it lose half its value. Like I would step in if I saw, I already own a copy of those books and I would buy another copy. That's how confident I am in the value of it. So yeah, I've definitely made mistakes.
Have you got any that have turned into a surprisingly good investment?
I'll be honest, buying Amazing Fantasy 15, First Prince of Spider-Man, when I bought it, which was 6-7 years ago, people were saying, oh, that book has nowhere left to go. It's already, if you looked at the past 15 years, it's already just run up and is way more expensive than it used to be. And there's no way it can go higher. So you don't know. I mean, I'm like, well, I'm betting on Spider-Man that he'll continue to be popular. And so that one has gone up. I bought a higher grade than I really wanted to, but I just saw a good deal come up and, spent $50,000 or something on it. And I remember that was the most expensive book I owned at the time. And it kind of heart palpitations, that type of thing. And I was like, I can't believe what I just did. Am I going to regret this? And then that one's worth significantly more just because Spider-Man keeps going.
Some people dream of like flying private jets or buying Lambos, and your wife wants to buy a Porsche or has bought a Porsche. Why was this your version of like a dream purchase? I
think because the reason that I got into entrepreneurship was 100% about freedom. It wasn't about getting rich for getting rich's sake. It wasn't money for money's sake. It was so I'd have enough money that I could work on whatever I wanted to for the rest of my life, because I love building shit, but I don't like building shit that other people tell me to build. So as a software engineer at big companies, it was agonizing that I was just like someone else's agenda. And the politics were bad too, but like it wasn't interesting work. And so for me, the whole thing around being a founder, being a maker, being an entrepreneur was I want to own my own time. So when I get to that end and it's like, cool, now I have freedom. The goal, I don't know, the money wasn't to buy luxury. Now, to that point though, my wife did a good job of saying, look, I want to buy a nicer house because in a big house, you know, we live in Minneapolis, it's not that expensive. And I resisted that a bit. I was like, ooh, like a house would cost 7 figures. That's like, I can't imagine that I would ever live in a house like that, you know? But she convinced me like, let's make the splurge. I think it will feel better. Just our life will be better. And you know what? She's right. I have no regrets about owning this home. I don't view it as an investment at all. I don't think it will go up. But that is probably one of the luxuries that she convinced me to do that I was resistant to, that I have enjoyed. And another one was frankly buying a Volvo. Volvo, again, I always drove just cheap ass Chevy Blazers my whole life, right? These very
entrepreneur mobiles.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I bought a salvage title one that had been totaled and repaired, and I paid like $8,000 cash for it and drove that for 15 years. I just don't care about luxury. But here's the thing. You live in Minneapolis, it is cold as balls in the winter. And so having remote start and heated seats and steering wheel, that's a luxury that I actually do appreciate. It's bougie, or it feels that way, but it's like, you know what? Just do it. You know, so there's a few things that I've fallen into, but look, I don't begrudge anyway. If you have money and you want to buy a sports car, do that. If that's your thing, I'm a guy buying freaking, decaying pieces of paper here, spending $40,000, $50,000. So I'm not one to, to judge anyone's taste and how they spend money.
There's something special about owning a piece of history, whether it's a comic, a Beatles gold record, or a startup with massive potential. It's a connection to something bigger and something that feels meaningful. And for Rob, that feeling is just as important as the investment itself.
Well, you're tracking it because you're like, I know this is insured as it's being shipped, but you are just nervous and you want to be there and you have to sign for it and show ID, and sometimes, look, I've had a couple books where people have flown here and I've met them at the airport and they've handed it to me. And then I take them out to drinks and dinner, and take them out. But at a certain point, it just makes sense to do that, when a book is that expensive. But no, I've had multiple moments where I walk out and I have this box and I think to myself, this could be a $10 dish towel that I bought on Amazon, but no, I know exactly what this is. And yeah, go in the kitchen, you open this thing up and there's all this packaging and you pull it out and I give it just a solid look of like, is it the grade they say it is? That's always the first thing. But then the other thing is just look at the majesty, that holding it in your hand, it really is a tangible feeling of like joy and accomplishment. And not a week goes by that I don't go through and look at the covers of almost every comic that I own.
That's cool.
There's only 50 of them. I just flip through them. They're in a box, I go to the bank for the expensive ones. I have the cheap ones that, I wouldn't want them to die in a fire, but if they did, I could deal with it. And it's really fulfilling to me.
Collecting isn't just about making money. It's about an emotional attachment to things that bring you back to that childlike joy. The financial side is just an added benefit. And if it's something you're interested in, here are a few things to remember. If you're going to invest in collectibles, you need to be into the thing you're collecting. Otherwise, the time, the research, the risk probably aren't worth it. Rob isn't just throwing his money at random stuff. He's leveraging decades of knowledge to make smart buys. And don't get caught up in chasing the hype. Buying just for value without understanding the long-term demand, like a banana taped to a canvas or a Bored Ape NFT, is a fast track to losing money.
I know people who, Bored Ape and all that stuff, that was a hot thing. We didn't know where it was going. Maybe you were on the ground floor. But if you do that with comic books or art, where it's this recent thing that's run up really quick, think about the value of that versus Superman #1 or Action Comics #1 that has been valuable now for 80 plus years. To me, it's the difference between gambling and investing, I guess, a little bit. So I think that's a mistake you can easily make, is seeing something that's running up, feeling like, well, it's hot, everyone's investing in that now. And usually that stuff, everyone forgets about it. And then once it's cold, it's hard to sell.
So if you found this interesting and you want to have more conversations with other founders who are exploring some of these interesting alternative investment strategies, you got to go and check out joinhampton.com. It's a highly vetted private community for founders and CEOs, high net worth individuals. And we're having these kinds of conversations all the time in private around how we're managing our money, the things we're investing in, how we're growing our startups. If that's the kind of thing that interests you, definitely go and check it out, joinhampton.com. And finally, I want to plug the production company that makes this podcast. It's called Lower Street. It's my company. Check it out at lowerstreet.co/moneywise. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, I want a podcast just like this for my company or for my personal brand, awesome. We'd love to chat to you. Head to lowerstreet.co/moneywise.